First of all, let me thank everyone, including speakers on the one hand and those who have already joined us on the other hand. Today we have the first event in a series of London School of Economics Ukraine series discussion, which will be composed of 4 events as of now, starting from today. And every week, starting from now, we will have an event updating both academia, society, and decision makers in other countries beyond Ukraine about how specific political, economic, and societal issues in Ukraine, not only during the times of the war, has been evolving, but also how Ukrainian contemporary situation is explained or can be explained by the history of independence of Ukraine. So my name is Mariia Zolkina. I'm DINAM Research Fellow at the London School of Economics at the International Relations Department. I will be a moderator of this discussion and of the next ones on LSE Ukraine series. And I'm extremely honored and pleased to start this first event, which will be dedicated to Ukraine's defense and foreign policy, lessons which we can draw from the past, and challenges which we can find out as actual and crucial for the future of Ukraine. Today, I'm joined by the panel of astonishing and distinguished speakers who are very well known, not only in Ukraine, but beyond Ukraine, and which is very important. They are known and recognized as authoritative expert and analysts, not only within academia environment, but also by decision makers and public policy makers, which make actually their expertise very applicable and very valuable. It's not just theory, it's about theory which can be applied to practical public policy making in the field of foreign and defense policy. So let me introduce our distinguished speakers for today. First of all is Dr. Olexiy Haran, who is professor of comparative politics at the the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and research director at the Ilko Kucheriv Democratic Initiatives Foundation, one of leading Ukrainian think tanks. Dr. Volodymyr Dubovyk, who is associate professor at the Department of International Relations and director at the Center for International Studies at Odesa, Mechnikov National University. Let me introduce also Dr. Katerina Zaremba, who is a Ukrainian public policy analyst and university lecturer, including a senior lecturer at the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and associate fellow at the New Europe Center, which is one of the leading Ukrainian think tanks dealing with foreign policy issues for many years already, and Dr. Oksana Sachi, who is an associate of the International Defense Hub of the European Values Center for Security Policy and program director of the project Protect, which is promoting reforms objectives through technical expertise and capacity project. She is also a visiting lecturer at the Kyiv Mohyla Business School. And since in the period of 2013 and 2021, she was very well known by everyone who worked with the foreign policy issues, because he was a senior political analyst and advisor to the head of NATO mission to Ukraine. So basically, we have people with incredible experience in the field of foreign and defense policy expertise. And now I'm about to start just asking the very first question to Professor Haran. Professor Haran, first of all, thank you a lot for being with us today. I have to say that you can't imagine how thankful I am as a moderator that you didn't break your promise to appear today at this event. Dr. Olexiy had a surgery last week, but he's a very responsible person who didn't skip and still will be with us today. So in your professional activity, you were commenting to journalists or giving lectures to your students from shelters, from under the shellings, from metro station at Donetsk airport in 2014, 2015, which was constantly shelled at that moment. And now, actually, I thought even that you would be from the hospital today, but fortunately you are back at home. So thank you, first of all, for being with us. And my question to you and to everyone else, just to start briefly, 2 minutes for a brief answer from everyone, and then we will go deeper to discussion. So the first question is, what couple of events in the modern history of Ukraine, in the field of foreign policy of Ukraine, would you name as the most crucial events for foreign policy of Ukrainian state? Just 1-2 minutes, briefly. What seems to be the most? What seems to have a fundamental, important significance when it comes to foreign policy of Ukraine? What has happened like that? So, Dr. Haran, your answer is first here. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Maria. I've just arrived from hospital to my room, just in time for this event. I am very thankful for London School of Economics for organizing this event. If to tell very briefly, the first event maybe would be surprising for you. I would say re-election of Kuchma on pro-Russian slogans, and then he started actually multi-vector policy with gradual shift towards the West. So I think this was a very, very important event. It's not just one-time event. It took several years, but it demonstrated profound changes in Ukrainian foreign policy, while balancing between Russia and the West, gradually moving towards the West. The second event, I would say, Russian aggression of 2014, which, as a result of which pro-Russian sentiments collapsed in Ukraine, and definitely the third event, full-scale invasion. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Haran. Volodymyr, your turn.
Yeah, I think that in the most contemporary history, I would say 3 events. Well, I would unite 2 events in one. I don't know, is that allowed or not, but 2 Maidans, even though there are 10 years in between them, during which Ukrainians proved to everyone, themselves first of all, and the rest of the world, that we are very serious about our democracy, about who is ruling our country. We're not willing to, get on with some cheating and fraud and falsification. And we're not willing to, continue living under dictatorship. So therefore, we are capable of actually exercising our rights and going to the streets and demanding change and defending democracy. And then the war, the start in 2014 and the massive invasion in 2022. And by the way, I would like to make sure for everyone who is watching, specifically from the Western audience from outside of Ukraine, is that there is no connection as a sequence, as a so-called of a, like reason and then a consequence kind of connection between the Euromaidan revolution of dignity on one hand and the start of Russian war, because a lot of people tend to think that somehow because Ukrainians did the revolution, that's how it led to Russian aggression. Russian aggression was actually launched because they saw Ukraine as vulnerable, as having this transitional period. That's a good time to attack. So, and of course, the major event, it's February 24th, 2022. So that's going to really determine a lot in our future, in the future of our international position and standing, and, actually in the region and globally maybe as well. We're not done with that war yet, but it's clear now that February 24th, 2022, of course, is a seminal event.
Great. Thank you, Volodymyr. Katerina, what is your perspective on what was the most crucial in terms of significance for our foreign policy?
From my perspective, this is the revolution of dignity. And of course, also the Russian aggression, which started in 2014, as Volodymyr explained, these are 2 separate events, just close in time and linked in time. But indeed, Russian aggression and Russian war has been prepared for many decades. So we should be aware this was just one point in time when Russia indeed took advantage of Ukraine's weakness at that point. But the revolution of dignity not only rebooted Ukraine as a democratic state, not only reinstated its democracy as a power of civil society, and I would like to underline that this has been the first, in Ukraine's independent history, this has been the first public uprising which comprised all of Ukraine from north to south, from east to west on such massive scale. So this was, a civic mobilization event which was really pan-Ukrainian, which then led to the fact that the European and Euro-Atlantic integration has been inscribed in Ukraine's constitution, so there was no more oscillation on the one hand, and on the other hand, specifically about defense and security policy, the revolutionary dignity first and then the Russian aggression second led to the fact that Ukraine reinvented its army and broke away from the security service linkage with the FSB, which was basically formally legalized in 2000, well, in many years, but most lately before the revolution dignity in 2012 with the formal agreement. I will stop here.
Thank you, Katerina. Oksana, what do you think on that?
Thank you very much, Maria. I would also like to commend you and your efforts in the London School of Economics for this event, because definitely it's very important to have Ukrainian voice speaking about Ukraine. And answering your question, my perspective would be, I think that the first event that I would name is surrendering the nuclear weapon of Ukraine for very unspecified and basically unimplemented security assurances, not even guarantees, but assurances, known as a notoriously known Budapest Memorandum. Because that created this strategic situation in which Russian aggression didn't have any deterrence factors against Ukraine. The second event, like I still will talk here more about the defense and security perspective. The second event will be Bucharest summit. And this very unspecified formula with regard to Ukraine and Georgia, that Ukraine and Georgia will become at some point NATO members, but with no clear commitments and with no clear path to it. This lucky formula was for decades utilized by the NATO Public Diplomacy Division because it was very comfortable. But unfortunately, this didn't lead to any practical action. And so on my list, definitely the third event will be also internal policy event, the revolution of dignity. But I agree here with Katerina, with all her arguments, how it shaped the foreign political agenda for Ukraine. That's why I dare to say that probably my third event, I still hope that I will live long enough to see it, will be the strategic defeat of the Russian Federation in this unprovoked aggression against Ukraine.
Thank you, Oksana. Actually, unintentionally, but all the speakers paved a path towards my question to Olexiy Haran about the link between domestic politics and domestic political processes on the one hand, and setting up the priorities for the foreign policy of Ukraine on the other hand. In contrast to many Central or European countries, which were very stable with their foreign policy priorities after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc in the Eastern and Central Europe, Ukrainian foreign policy was fluctuating, and priorities were to some extent dependent on the replacement of people in power or political parties in power. As a professor of comparative politics, Olexiy, can you please elaborate a bit more on that? So how do you see, what were the most significant stages in Ukrainian contemporary history when domestic politics impacted and affected actually the foreign policy priorities? In what way it was positive, like maybe you mentioned it in your first answer, in your brief answer, about beginning of incremental movement towards pro-Western foreign policy agenda, but sometimes it could have completely different, harmful impact on Ukraine's security, like so-called non-black status created by, at that time, Yanukovych, at that time president. The floor is yours, Olexiy. Unmute yourself.
How much time do I have?
You have 10-13 minutes.
10-13 minutes. Okay. So let me start with the first event, which is the creation of Commonwealth of Independent States, because I believe it demonstrates very well how Ukrainian foreign politics was forming. So on the one hand, Ukraine was the founder of the Commonwealth of Independent States, but on the other hand, the Ukrainian parliament didn't ratify the charter. So from the formal point of view, Ukrainian position was very, very unique. Founder of the CIS, but not a member of the CIS. And it actually reflects the Ukrainian position. while trying, trying to have these balances, trying to be in good relations with Russia, but at the same time to distance itself from Russia. I have already told about the fact of Kuchma, who was being elected on pro-Russian ticket, with promises of improving relations with Russia, of introducing the official status for the Russian language. But here it was the thing which then happened basically to all Ukrainian presidents. All Ukrainian presidents promised at the beginning that they would like to have good relations with Russia. When they try to build these good relations with Russia, it appears no, it's impossible. It's impossible because Russia wants too much. And if you try, to attract one part of the country by pro-Russian agenda, the other part of the country will not accept it. So to be the president of Ukraine, you need to have a balanced approach. So as I have said, this multi-vector policy, which was under Kuchma, we saw it repeated then to some extent under Yushchenko and then even under Yanukovych. 1994, Ukraine giving up nuclear weapons. And by the way, what is interesting in the Russian and Ukrainian text, the term is security guarantees. So in English version, it's security insurance, and in Russian and Ukrainian, it's security guarantees. So it shows that it wasn't, connect very well. But definitely this document was just, a paper. However, it unblocked the movement for the development of relations between Ukraine and the West and Russia. And with 1997, with NATO, we signed the Charter on Distinctive Partnership. I think a lot of people have already forgotten about it. The Charter on Distinctive Partnership. We couldn't be in the enlargement wave of NATO, but at least we got this Charter on Distinctive Partnership. And at the same time, it's a big treaty with Russia, which promised territorial integrity and respect for territorial integrity. So I think basically this was a success for Kuchma. And as I have said, under Kuchma, for the first time, it appeared that Ukraine is going to move closer to the EU and NATO. It was under Kuchma. But then, in domestic politics, Kuchma was sliding to authoritarian. And Russia tried to use it to isolate him from the West. So there was a period of deterioration of relations with the West, with Kolchuga scandal, with Tapegate scandal, and as a result, we saw the Orange Revolution of 2004, Yushchenko coming to power, and basically here I would say regarding the EU, Yushchenko's policy was based on what have already been done, but he moved further. He moved further and said that he is going to start negotiations with the EU on free trade agreement. Again, there was nothing wrong with about compatibility with free trade agreement with Russia, because we know that the country may have as much free trade agreements as possible. So it was under Yushchenko. And by the way, Russia never protested. Russia never protested the talks which started between Yushchenko and the EU on association agreement. What was new in the Yushchenko's policy was NATO, and Russia definitely was protesting about it. So Yanukovych came to power in 2010. Again, he came on, well, I would say pro-Russian slogans, because the country was extremely deliberately polarized since 2004. So Yanukovych made a lot of pro-Russian promises. In reality, I argue that he tried to continue multi-vector policy. He basically continued negotiations with the EU on association agreement, and this agreement was initial under Yanukovych. So it was fully prepared under Yanukovych. At the same time, Yanukovych tried to soothe Russians, and that's why he said, okay, we will be non-bloc country. So he didn't consider it very important. And by the way, it relied, unfortunately, also on the views of Ukrainians. Ukrainians that time, they believed that Ukraine can play the role of non-bloc country. So Yanukovych did it because he considered it's not very important for security reasons. He was thinking that he would be able both to continue association agreement with the EU and to receive concessions from Russia on cheaper Russian gas. And then we know what happened. We know what happened: pressure from Russia, isolation of Yanukovych, and then we got a revolution of dignity, which definitely was, and subsequently Russian aggression, which was a turning point, because this was collapse of the security structures in Europe, and it was revealing experience for Ukrainians that it's not possible to deal with Russia, and it's necessary actually to go into to move closer to NATO. That's why I would like to stress, because now it's in the focus of the debates. Well, maybe Ukraine should be more flexible towards Russia, give some concessions, refuse membership in NATO, and it will be basis of compromise for Russia. But we saw what happened in 2014 when Ukraine was non-nuclear, non-bloc. Ukrainians didn't want to join NATO. Russia guaranteed our integrity, and Russia attacked. So, you know, being non-bloc will not guarantee your security, and we know that Russia will never stop. So if they would be able to push forward, so they will do that. That's why we need more stable security environment and security guarantees in forms that we may discuss. Otherwise, Putin will continue to try to move forward. So that's why when we hear now a lot of peaceful plans about ceasefire, let's make a ceasefire. Well, ceasefire will only seal Russian occupation of Ukraine, the demographic change of the Ukrainian population, total totalitarian control of this territory, and will create a platform for further Russian aggression. So I think it's very important not to be engaged in this, I would say, smoke screening negotiations about peace and ceasefire. I think it's very important to push Russians to solve at least several important points if they want negotiations. The point number one: stop bombardment of Ukrainian civilians. Point number two: withdrawal of Russian soldiers from Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. What they are doing there. Point number three, for example, grain corridors, which will be beneficial for all the countries in the world. So for all those intermediaries, or those who are trying to propose themselves as intermediaries, I would suggest, look, if you would like to demonstrate your weight, that you can do something, please, you consider Putin your partner, you consider him to be rational, push him to fulfill at least these three initial steps. And then we will see to what extent he is really willing negotiations, and to what extent you guys from China, Brazil, Africa, Vatican are influential enough to persuade Mr. Putin to do at least these first concrete steps. Thanks a lot.
Olexiy, may I put just one question just on the top of what you have said about the changes of public moods within Ukraine? Will it be fair to say now that because Ukrainians are, like absolute majority of Ukrainians are in favor of either NATO or specific security guarantees in addition or before NATO membership, will it be fair to say that actually the political leaders of the country, both current and any future, in the coming years, will not be possible to change this kind of priority just because the domestic publics doesn't accept any kind of being out of security structures anymore?
You know, unfortunately, it's possible to manipulate with public opinion. Unfortunately, we know about it in different countries. However, having said that, we remember the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and we remember that at that time, Ukrainian government was at least talking about possibility, you know, to have some non-block status in talks with Russia, and the polls demonstrated that Ukrainians didn't want it. So even at that time, the most dramatic times of the Russian aggression, when Russian armies were close to Kyiv, Ukrainians didn't want to have this this concession to Russia to stop Russian aggression. So I hope that Ukrainian public opinion is quite crystallized on that, and the present and future governments will need to take it into account. Thank you.
Thank you, Oleksiy. Now, just switching from the importance or the significance of I hear echo somehow. Switching from the importance of domestic factors for foreign policies setting, I would like to switch to Professor Dubovyk, who is well-known expert on U.S. foreign policy, on Ukraine and U.S. bilateral relations, Black Sea security. Volodymyr, a lot of Ukrainian experts or scholars dealing with Ukraine and with Eastern Europe actually blamed even U.S., what to say about some other countries, for perceiving Ukraine constantly like someone or something in the shadow of Russia, both in 90s and after 2000s. Like even for US, who is a strategic donor of Ukraine now during the times of the war, we still have a problem with receiving a clear answer whether Ukraine or when Ukraine is going to become a NATO member. And actually, there is a concern, I would say, on the side of Ukrainian scholars, decision makers, and Ukrainian society, that this kind of perception, how Russia will react, will still be preserved, maybe on a lower level, let's say, than it was previously, but still. How will you explain how did that factor played a specific role for our foreign policy, and whether this fact will play further for Ukraine's foreign policy, for perception of Ukraine, especially when it comes to a strategic partnership with the US?
Right. So thank you, Mariia, for inviting me to speak at this panel. And like Oksana has mentioned already, it's a real pleasure and privilege to be part of this distinguished panel. And everyone at LSE who is involved in putting it together, thank you as well. So yes, I think that there has always been a very substantial dose of Russian-centrism or Russocentrism in Western policies towards the post-Soviet space. They often saw and still see this vast space as a single space, as a regional bloc of countries. Even 30 plus years after Soviet Union has disappeared, that it's a problem, it was a problem clearly in the 1990s, but that was understandable. Soviet Union just ceased to exist. And I wrote my candidate of science dissertation and defended it in 1996, and that was on US policy towards Ukraine. And there I actually wrote a lot about Russocentrism among American politicians and scholars and experts. But even since then, yeah, you're right. I think a lot of people were basically thinking like, okay, Russia is dominating, it's too big. The people who represent the political realism school, they're saying the same way. I mean, at least some of them, because we can distinguish perhaps within political realism, you actually have some people who are definitely not agreeing with people like John Mearsheimer or Stephen Walt, some others being political realists as such. Yeah, there is such a point of view that Ukraine and other smaller countries around Russia and Russia's periphery, immediate vicinity of Russia, they're just doomed by their geopolitical position, that they have to actually be given away to Russia somehow. And that is reflected in the thinking of a lot of people in the West, in Europe and United States. Clearly, President Obama was of this opinion to some extent. And when the Russian war in Ukraine started in 2014, we saw it by his reaction, his administration, at what Russia was doing. Sanctions didn't go too far. No decision on non-lethal weapons supply to Ukraine, many other things, and actually even before he left the White House, he gave this now famous or infamous, for whatever reasons, interview to the Atlantic Monthly, talking to Joshua Goldberg, chief editor, and said that, there are red lines with Ukraine, we can't cross them in dealing with Russia. And anyhow, Ukraine is more important to Russia than to us. And we don't have enough leverage, and Russia does. So Russia cares really about Ukraine. We kind of don't. I mean, yeah, we would like to support them, but not to the same extent as Russia. So that was very characteristic of that administration. And since I remember Obama, he left a very, divisive legacy in the history of bilateral relations, because you had people in his administration who were demanding a more resolute response to Russian aggression, and he decided against them. And even on issue of supplying lethal weapons, most people in his administration, including military people, were actually in favor. And he was his, most close advisors, domestic political advisors, decided, no, we're not going to do that. So yeah, unfortunately, there was a problem, and was signaling that United States offered in the previous years and after 2014 as well. There is also a problem. There was a problem, like we can remember clearly the 2008. When Russia, started and launched their aggression in August war against Georgia, and what was the Western reaction there? Actually, 2 presidential campaigns of that year, including Obama's, but also, of course, by John McCain, they quickly criticized Russia, but then it was forgotten and the page was turned. President Obama started reset policies instead. So basically decided, okay, we're going to improve relations with Russia. We're going to start from scratch, we're going to just turn the page again. So same thing by NATO, by the way, because they were at that point of time primarily interested in keeping the northern distribution network to Afghanistan intact when they had started having problems with Pakistan and the southern distribution network. So they worked with Russia, and even there were some people, there were some bases like for NATO in Russia, that the logistics bases on the way to Afghanistan. And so that's what happened, so people were wondering, like, okay, well, that happened to Georgia, maybe Saakashvili played a role with his temperament and so on, started blaming Georgia instead of Russia. And Russia said, okay, fine, if they're reacting this way, okay, we can plan something else for the future, for the coming years. And that was very problematic, because, of course, people were saying, like, okay, that was Georgia, a small country, just 4 million people, but Ukraine is a bigger country, so Russia wouldn't dare to attack Ukraine, but it did in 2014. And again, the pundits, experts, whatever name we can call them, they were saying, like, okay, that was like very small, tactical, incremental, just two regions, Crimea and Donbass. So it's unthinkable to even imagine a massive, large-scale invasion, and that happened in February 2022. So I guess for any Western audience, they need to understand that, never say never, everything's possible. So whenever someone is saying today that indeed, Baltics or Poland or Romania or someone else, or Kazakhstan or Moldova, can be next, they can be next, because Russia, if they are, God forbid, prevail in the conflict vis-a-vis Ukraine, and we hope and we are kind of convinced and confident that they wouldn't be able to do that, still, then if they would be able to have some kind of satisfying result of this war with Ukraine, let's say so, then they'll be emboldened. I mean, they'll be weakened, but then they'll collect forces together, more forces, and then attack other countries. So that's on the issue of Russocentrism and sending wrong signals, and other signals, by the way, early in Syria war since 2011, you also had situation when Obama drew, his own lines, red lines about Syria, if Assad attacks his own people with chemical weapons, we're going to go in and do a military operation. And he did, and Assad did, and Obama didn't. So a lot of people tell this was also a very important divisive line. Clearly in Turkey, I spent a week talking to Turkish colleagues about months ago, and everyone I met with my group of Tufts University were mentioning this moment as a decisive moment for everyone in the region, but also to Moscow. And that unblocked a kind of a way for military intervention by Russia in Syria, by the way, which is still ongoing. So going back to the early years, I mean, some mistakes been made, of course. I wouldn't, though, I wouldn't note the denuclearization of Ukraine as one of those mistakes that we have made. The only problem was probably that we haven't asked enough, we haven't received enough, but it was time to denuclearize. You could remember the situation was very difficult. Ukraine was very young, economic ties were disrupted. We had a crazy inflation, completely unstable currency, very difficult economic situation within the country. So we were much more interested in financial support from Western countries than in keeping nuclear weapons. Not to mention that we didn't really keep them because the red button was still in the hands of Moscow. So it was a very uncomfortable position for Ukraine anyway. So in terms of Budapest Memorandum, I actually belong to those who think that it was pretty much fulfilled by those who signed it. I mean, except for Russia, obviously, who violated it, but the United Kingdom and United States, they are, if you look at the Budapest Memorandum, a very small document. I mean, a lot of people make statements about it without even looking into it. It's actually calling only for two things. One is if Ukraine is attacked, they're going to bring the issue to the attention of the international community. And they did on many occasions, on various occasions. And the second is they're going to engage in a bilateral, in consultations, it says. So it doesn't say bilateral or multilateral, but in consultations with Ukraine. And they did, of course, UK and US since 2014, and let alone now during this massive war. So some people just tend to believe that Budapest Memorandum was more, which was treated more as the spirit of the document, a broader understanding, not a narrow one. For the international law, for the agreements that we sign, that's not how we proceed. So therefore, we can talk about Russia violating. We can talk about how, by the way, China and France signed similar documents to Budapest Memorandum, basically very identical in many ways, at the same time as nuclear powers. And what are they doing, to protect Ukraine's security in the light of Russian aggression? And we can also talk, and we should talk, and I'm talking all the time about that Ukrainian political class, not the experts, by the way, were completely convinced for a number of years that Budapest Memorandum is not a viable, effective guarantee of Ukrainian security at all. So you need to turn page, forget about it, and move on. And Ukraine should work to get better kind of guarantees and better framework and better mechanisms that would protect our security better. That somehow our political class was maybe living under impression that Budapest Memorandum provides such security guarantees. Well, that's their problem. That's not a problem of London and Washington. London and Washington maybe should have just talked frankly to Ukraine and Kyiv and said, you know what, Budapest Memorandum is not something which you can rely on if Russia attacks you, especially in a full-scale aggression. So that's what Ukraine was trying to do. In NATO, of course, prior to the distinctive partnership charter that Olexiy has mentioned, of course, we were the first one in the Commonwealth and United States to join a Partnership for Peace program. With a distinctive partnership, by the way, Russia got the same. Olexiy didn't mention that. At the same time with Ukraine, two countries outside of NATO got this distinctive partnership. So, but then we moved on, and then the second term of Kuchma happened, and I like to disagree with my esteemed colleagues, and 99% of the cases I agree with Olexiy, for instance, but on Kuchma, I think that his second term was extremely negative for Ukraine. It's really bad for domestic political development, even though it kind of opened in the way then the window for the Orange Revolution to happen, but ironically. But in terms of him being isolated and then Ukraine being isolated, I don't think Russia was really trying hard to isolate Ukraine. Kuchma was doing that himself. So I think the early 2000s were actually the ideal time for Ukraine to move decisively towards membership in NATO. But it just did happen that we had the wrong president doing the wrong domestic and foreign policy at that point of time. So you can remember the summit in Prague when he was seated in certain order so that even like people like American president wouldn't sit next to him and so on. That was very manifesting and characteristic of how Ukraine was viewed at that point of time. So whatever Kuchma did then, sending some troops to Iraq, to coalition of willing multinational coalition led by US and other things, didn't help. Whatever he started talking about NATO membership, also to maybe soften the situation for him because he was really frozen out, didn't help. That he started talking about membership in 2002, that there was a law on national security passed in 2003 with the entire party of regions led by Yanukovych voting in favor of that law on national security, which called for Ukraine to join NATO as a priority for Ukraine. So, and then of course the Orange Revolution happened, and what again was unfortunate, the window opened and closed. there was Ukraine fatigue, and for a reason, because people were expecting Ukraine to move forward quickly with reforms and everything, fighting corruption. That didn't happen. So therefore, everyone is disappointed. Even the later times Bush administration, Bush W administration, who liked Ukraine, who liked the Orange Revolution very much so, and they actually thought of Ukraine as a poster boy for this democracy transformation in post-Soviet space. But then they saw what's going on, what's happening after the Orange Revolution. They were not convinced. And when Obama came to power, he didn't like Ukraine too much because he thought it's a Bush project. So why should we even support Ukraine? So that was problematic. But until now, to try to conclude and abuse my time limits, I would like to say that U.S. traveled a long way in terms of seeing its relation with Russia and Ukraine. Too many times Russia was disappointing and actually quite openly hostile to U.S. And they've been learning their lessons slowly, as I have mentioned, because it was reset and other things. But now they've learned that lesson. Now they're not laughing about one's candidate for president from Republican Party, Mitt Romney, saying that Russia is a major threat, and then Obama and others were kind of laughing and saying what he's talking about. Yeah, it is a threat. If you look at the national security strategy of the United States, China and Russia is threat. Well, China is kind of a long-term threat, a challenge. Russia is a acute threat right now. So that's how they see it now. And then they now understand the significance of Ukraine. And that's now why they in US think not just about what to give to Ukraine to help us to withstand in this war, even though they are sometimes hesitating between would they want to see Ukraine not to lose, or would they want Ukraine to win? There is major distinction there. And that's depending on how you answer this question, you decide what to give to Ukraine in terms of weapons. So they haven't made that choice, unfortunately. There are some debates within the administration as well. But there is understanding of significance of Ukraine going forward strategically, right? So therefore, they are already talking about recovery and rebuilding. They're already talking about some security guarantees. They're already talking about some format of how to provide Ukraine with better security in the coming years and decades. And that might not include membership in NATO. We'll see if, and I'm going to leave some space here to both Katerina and Oksana on that. That doesn't mean that we in Vilnius in July we're going to receive some big kind of invitation to NATO, probably not. But at the same time, the talk in town here in Washington, for instance, and other places, is that Ukraine might get some new format. But at the same time, as Olexiy has mentioned, I think other people mentioned as well, Ukraine is working with NATO intensively already anyway. So we are in many ways like de facto member, but unfortunately without Article 5, without the guarantee of our security, without them being willing to send troops. I don't see that changing, not on US, not on other countries' part, that they would actually revisit their position from when we were asking them a year ago to close the sky, for instance. I think that decision still stands, that they shouldn't be, present in this conflict, and they shouldn't invite Ukraine to NATO anytime soon. But there is some development, and there is a wake-up call. And there are some people, I don't know if the West, including US, is ready for the new systemic protracted Cold War against Russia. I'm not sure about that. And that might not be the case, but they heard the wake-up call. And in many places around the West, people are really terrified with what they're seeing. And therefore, I think there will be a lingering effects of this war, which is not over yet. And of course, much will depend on how it will end and when it will end. But I think we are going to see that Ukraine will continue to be a staple, a critical element in Eastern European and basically European security in general.
Yeah, Volodymyr, just a very brief answer, if it's possible, to my follow-up question on that. So many in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine see now that the domestic political discussion, which might outbreak in, or maybe it already has started, in US in the light of upcoming presidential elections, might be a serious challenge not only for bipartisan support to Ukraine in terms of military and financial aid for next year, but also for this kind of final picture of how Ukraine should win or how Russia should lose. You are one of the rare scholars from Ukraine who almost equally combine your work in academia in Ukraine and in US. So you know both environment perfectly well. So what can you say about that? Is it the real challenge for us to think about?
It is a challenge, and the role of public is huge. And by the way, in Ukrainian side as well, because the public now is completely, convinced in Ukraine for a good reason. Of course, look at what's going on with us, and that we need to be within NATO and EU. So the vacuum of security, the gray zone that we were in for previous years, a lot of people didn't understand that. But now that we are alone against Russia, such a formidable enemy, people will get it like, oh, sure, of course we need to be within NATO. So there's going to be some pressure on President Zelensky within Ukraine. So it's not his decision just on NATO and EU. People are going to ask of him like, okay, what are we doing to get closer to membership? But on the American side as well, yes, there is a discussion within the country, and unfortunately, one big segment and one of the parties, Republican, is chosen to really involve itself in the anti-Ukrainian campaign. Because what you're seeing from the Trump corner and his supporters is not just questioning maybe the necessity for support of Ukraine. You're actually having a anti-Ukrainian hysteria, I can tell you, because I'm from time to time watching some of their main online assets and so on, and they are basically saying Ukraine is bad. We have no idea why we're supporting Ukraine and not Russia in this war. Ukraine is corrupt, Zelensky is a dictator, and look at what they're doing to the church in Ukraine. They're kind of persecuting the religious people in Ukraine and stuff like that. And anyway, Zelensky is choosing this liberal democratic model, which is not good for us. So the international order, President Trump, he said when he was president, we don't like this international order. So he not only he wasn't willing to support it and defend it, that people were expecting from President of the United States, but he was saying, I'm personally against this existing international order because it's biased against American interests. So yeah, if you add some problems like with default, with national debt, with people thinking that they're spending too much, not enough in the country, there is some appetite and there is some support for this idea. But luckily for us, there is also other part of the Republican Party which is not completely defeated. So very encouraging words a few days ago from Speaker McCarthy, prompted by a Russian journalist during his trip to Israel, when he said, I'm completely in favor of support of Ukraine, and what Russia is doing in Ukraine, including killing Ukrainian children, is completely unacceptable. So that was a big statement by Speaker McCarthy, who is a key figure there. He's beholden to some extent to the Trump MAGA faction in the House of Representatives, but he is also trying to charter his course in more independent way. In the Senate, of course, we are less concerned about the Senate. And on the Democratic side, by the way, Biden himself might change his position on Ukraine at some point of time. They're saying we're going to stay with Ukraine as long as it takes, but what does it even mean? How long exactly? And what do we mean by staying? You can give tens of billions of dollars, you can give billions, you can give millions. You can give more weapons, you can give less weapons. You can actually come to the conclusion that Ukraine cannot win this war, and therefore we're going to just continue giving them a little bit so they defend themselves against the potential Russian offensive. Or you can actually give Ukraine more so Ukraine liberates of our land. So I think there is a very acute and deep discussion within the administration. And the Democratic Party, the guy who is, son of, nephew of former President John Kennedy, son of his brother Robert Kennedy Jr., he was polling just a couple of weeks ago in 19% of support in the Democratic base. And that's a guy who's on a daily basis now, basically repeating Russian narrative from this war. So there might be a problem on the left wing of that party as well. So we'll see where we're going. Right now, I'm cautiously optimistic, but when the time comes, let's say end of summer, maybe fall, and the administration comes again to the Congress to ask for another big package of support to Ukraine, there might be a problem. I still think the people who will be supporting this package would be outnumbering those who will be opposing, but there will be a very, very serious discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Volodymyr, for your insights. I'll move now to Dr. Zarembo. Katerina, Volodymyr has mentioned that the policy of Western partners was pretty much Russia-centric. But the foreign policy of Ukraine itself was pretty Western-centric, which on the one hand brought some advantages and benefits for Ukraine, because actually anti-Russian, or I like more like pro-Ukrainian coalition appeared pretty fast after Russia invaded Ukraine on a large scale in 2022. But on the other hand, Ukraine was losing diplomatically in terms of its representation in other regions around the globe. So basically, how do you assess the results of this Western-centric foreign policy of Ukraine when we were concentrated more on membership in the European Union and later in NATO on the one hand? The second question is, we all think about NATO when it comes to security issues, but European Union as a global actor also has its own challenges when it comes to common foreign and security, common defense and security policy. And for the European Union, it will be most probably a big discussion how to adjust to new realities, on what to rely more, on membership in NATO of certain countries, which are simultaneously the members of the EU, or on rethinking common foreign, common defense and security policy of the EU, and whether there will be a place for Ukraine in that new security landscape until Ukraine becomes a full-fledged member of the European Union. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mariia. I would like to join my colleagues in the expression of gratitude, not only for you personally and to London School of Economics for bringing the Ukrainian agenda high and giving floor to the Ukrainian voices, but also for the topic of the discussion itself, because the reappraisal of the past mistakes, the lessons which we can draw from them, and then the challenges for the future and the ways of their resolution is extremely important. Specifically because I think that this was Ukraine foreign policy has lacked systemically. And if you allow, I will just start off with some reflections which I made as preparing for the discussion about the mistakes and lessons from the past. I would like to start with the conclusion which I reached about the fact that what united actually Ukraine and the West, I would say both the EU and other countries of Europe and the US, is that what I would call extreme short-sightedness about Russia, about the threat it poses and about what it means and what its real goals are, despite many signals which Russia sent, one of the most recent ones, of course, being the attack against Georgia. I mean, before 2014. What we know from the KGB practices, the so-called demoralization stage, in which Russia wants to achieve a whole generation of the people being oblivious to the Russian threat, to perceiving Russian threat, has been achieved excellently, both in Ukraine, 2012 and 2013, who would expect a Russian attack, despite the attempt to take control of the Tuzla Island. So even in this way, Ukraine was extremely short-sighted. Not to say about the West. So even in 2014, 2015, I think all members of this virtual room have spent infinite amount of hours explaining what is the cause of the war in the East, and the fact that the Crimea is not any kind of historical property of Russia or something. So this is what was characteristic of Ukraine's foreign policy and also Western view of Russia. Western belief in the fact that Russia can democratize, can be an equal partner, offers to Russia to join Eastern Partnership, various kinds of policies open to Russia on a par with other Eastern European states, if you can call Russia a European state. Which, and again, this is this kind of oxymoron or short-sightedness, which we could see from the West, from the US, reset between the US and Russia, of course, as a part of the Western policy, the EU-Russia partnership summits, and so on. To this belongs the depreciation of the military power. And this is kind of, to me, this appears as a something quite illogical, because I would say that the realist tradition is quite strong, both in academia and in policy circles. However, what we did see, at least in Europe, and at least in the EU and in Ukraine, is cutting down on the army budget, cutting down the numbers of the active personnel. So again, you also may remember all these conversations up until very recently about reinvention of NATO's raison d'être. What does it exist for? And there are other threats and not hard threats which we should talk about. So again, this depreciation of the Russian threat and consequences in specific countries' policies, including Ukraine until 2014, has been immense. And this is a mistake which we should not repeat again. And this brings me to the point which was made by my colleagues. I think both Professor Haran and Professor Dubovyk mentioned it, about how Ukrainian victory should look like and how Russian loss should look like. This is important because if we, again, just accept an incomplete measure, an incomplete and interim kind of agreement, letting Russia retain its power, it means that we will enter the same cycle, the same problem again in some years, most likely in our very observable future of our own lives. Now, the third point about lessons and conclusions from the past is about actually accepting these short-term unsustainable solutions. Again, it regards both Ukraine and the West. We have talked already about the Budapest Memorandum. Yes, okay, we've been talking here for how many years? For almost 30 years about these assurances and guarantees. But the point is, Ukraine referred to it, Ukraine counted on it. So this is something which we understand there is, it cannot be any kind of political assurance is impossible as a way for Ukraine security guarantees. And of course, NATO is, from what we see now, from the public support, from the situation on the ground, is the only possible guarantee which Ukraine can accept. Yes, it seems to be hard to achieve now, but, and here, Mariia, I come already to your very precise question of this westernization of Ukraine's foreign policy. I think specifically for the EU, Ukraine has been this kind of litmus test of what the EU and the European part of NATO, let's put it this way, know about themselves. So the European Union has been reinventing itself, whether it is aware of this or not, many times, thanks to Ukraine. We can start with very minute from today's perspective steps, as, for example, visa-free regime. Now it is something that I think Ukrainians are more or less used to and even probably take for granted. But at the point of adopting a decision about the visa-free regime, it was not at all taken for granted. And many voices in the EU would say it's impossible. Ukraine is too big a country. We expect too much influx of whoever. Then I've started speaking about the movement of people. The EU was reluctant, and still has not happened, to open for freedoms to Ukraine. One of the key concerns being there would be too much influx of the people from Ukraine, illegal migrants, whoever. You have now 7 million of Ukrainians in the EU. The EU hasn't collapsed. People are integrating well. So every time Ukraine shows the EU that it actually can do more than it thinks it can. Now, of course, much more prominent examples are from the last year, granting Ukraine, granting is the wrong word because granting something that's for granted, providing Ukraine, accepting Ukraine as a candidate country state in the EU, of course, again, something that in May or April last year was not a given. And of course, the changing of position of many countries in the EU, but I would underline here Germany about the weapon provision. I completely agree with Professor Volodymyr Dubovyk about the amount of weapons which we get and the timing of these weapons. But the point is, for Germany, this what is called the Zeitenwende, really the reinvention of their own security identity after the Second World War. So what is going on, what's currently stated on the website of German Ministry of Foreign Affairs for as long as it takes, or something like this. This is a quote. Yeah, Ukraine could want more. Ukraine does need more, but providing weapons from Germany specifically, and also from other countries, this is very, very important. A late development for Ukraine, but an important internal development for the states in the EU and in NATO. As for Ukraine's allocation of resources here, with whom Ukraine has worked, I can just only say that I completely agree with your criticism about this lack of resources. And I remember back in 2016, I think, at the New Europe Center, we did a survey among the Ukrainian diplomats, asking them about this kind of key achievements in Ukraine's foreign policy all over the independence period, and also key mistakes and key failures. And one of the key failures, which was mentioned, I think, by half of the ambassadors who took part in our survey, was the lack of resources, lack of actual ambassadors and diplomatic missions in various regions outside Western countries, albeit, let's also be honest, that even in some EU countries, Ukraine has been like an ambassadors and presence, or I mean, even if the ambassadors were there, they did not necessarily perform as well as they should. I think this was because, because of foreign policy short-sightedness, a kind of lack of awareness of how Ukraine can engage and be useful to and rely on countries in the global south, in Asia, and why Ukraine needs these voices. So there was lack of awareness for that. On the other hand, of course, there is lack of resources, and it persists. Also, let's be honest, so the cadre hunger. On the one hand, we do have a lot of young, motivated graduates, but when we look even for very crucial positions and very limited number of positions, it's hard to fill them in. And the call of the Minister Kuleba for the open call for ambassadors is, I think, the best illustration of this. So it is both, so the kind of lack of awareness probably of which regions are important, which countries are important, how to be present there, and also the cadre hunger, the expertise hunger, and well, of course, the financial factor matters too. As I said, it goes on, and I would especially underline that from my personal academic and policy perspective, I can see how much is still needed to fill in various niches and in the chairs of the universities to support Ukrainian studies, and how it is important that the country is self-sustainable. Yes, so I mean, I can allow myself to be very honest about paying our own money for our own studies. Yes, not to rely on someone else. So this is extremely important and still a niche. Of course, during the active war, we have primarily our concerns are about financing our army and buying the best drones and the best equipment possible for our men and women who fight at the front line. But this is something, a strategic concern. We should be there and we should talk about. I of course congratulate the opening of the Ukrainian institutes in Europe, but this comes unfortunately too slowly and on a too slow and too minute level. Yeah, so it's too few of these institutes exist at the moment. So westernization, I did say, and you the security actor, you asked me. I think. Well, in terms of CSDP, so Common Security and Defense Policy, Ukraine has been already on the equal footing with the EU, seeing eye to eye. Before the big invasion, it has always had some of the highest level of, it's called not integration, but alignment, yes, alignment of positions and participating in the EU missions. So after the start of the big invasion, Ukraine has summoned again its personnel, but before that it had very high ranks of participation. That said, to be honest, I do not really believe in kind of, Europe, as we discussed between ourselves in the preparation of this event, of the Europe of various speeds in terms of security. I think that the importance of NATO has only been stressed, and the EU, despite the fact that the European member states now beef up their military budgets, their military equipment, their arms, despite this fact, they are not ready to rely on themselves. I mean, this is, they are not even ready to, let's say, review, and this brings again the point about this future security architecture. They cannot, a problem in the first and foremost Germany, because I know the context well, but also the Netherlands, also France, also Italy. They cannot so far spell out very concretely what Ukraine's victory and Russian failure, Russian loss should look like. Specifically, what do we mean? What happens to Russia? What kind of steps do we take to ensure that Russia does not attack again? What kind of disarmament shall we be? What kind of denuclearization we can demand? And so on and so forth. So, so they cannot even envisage this kind of steps. I do not see any discussion of strategic reimagining of the EU as a security actor and of the EU member states as security actors within the EU, no outside NATO. So I would not really speak about that. Maybe I'm missing something. Colleagues will correct me. I will probably stop here.
Okay, thank you, Katerina. Actually, we are coming back here to that maybe kind of reincarnation of the shadow of Russian factor, because directly, like it played a role previously, it maybe not present on the political landscape anymore when it comes to perception of what is Ukraine and how to deal with Ukraine, but lack of strategic understanding of how to build the relations with Russia further still affect supporting Ukraine, or actually lack of understanding what the final settlement is, desirable one for all the partners of Ukraine. And here we come to our fourth speaker, which has, in my opinion, one of the most unique expertise when it comes to Ukraine cooperation with NATO, because Oksana Sacha was aware about the real practical level of cooperation in the field of security and defense, on a technical level, on a political level, and combination of understanding of how political landscape in NATO-Ukraine relations affected or not affected the level of technical cooperation which allowed Ukrainian defense forces and security and defense sector generally to be transformed. This combination makes the expertise of Oksana is extremely important and valuable for this discussion. So basically, I have like two questions to you, Oksana. So first of all, what can you answer to those who constantly were saying that Ukraine was kept out of NATO because of fear that Russia would escalate the situation on the ground? Was it miscalculation? Was it just a formal argument? What are your thoughts about that on the one hand? And the second question is, to what extent technically the cooperation between NATO or NATO programs for transformation of Ukraine security and defense sector was successful, even when the political rapprochement of Ukraine with NATO was maybe not so visible to the audience?
Thank you very much, Maria. Yes, you're absolutely right with the questions, and I also need to confess that indeed I had a huge luck to work in the NATO office since 2013, and even better luck probably to leave NATO office on the 1st of February last year, because now at least I can be in your audience and talk publicly about some things that I would like to raise here. In terms of the question with regard to Russia and the practical cooperation with NATO Ukraine, I would a little bit maybe turn around your first question, because those who says that Ukraine was kept out of NATO all this time to please people who were scared of the possible Russian escalation, is also the same question to those who say that Russian aggression and full-scale invasion last year was caused by the critical approachment between NATO and Ukraine, and plans of NATO to enlarge very soon in near, visible future. So both those statements, I think that they contain some very dangerous narratives, which are now very much used not only by the Russian propaganda, but also let us be clear, also by the Chinese propaganda about two Western and Russian blocs fighting over the Ukraine, which doesn't have any sovereignty, which doesn't have any subjectiveness in the international relations. So in terms of Ukrainian closeness to NATO back in February last year, I can clearly assure you that probably politically, at least for sure, and to some extent also militarily, Ukraine were not closer to NATO on the 23rd February 2022 than it was back in 2013. Because as much as the technical cooperation went on, as much as the interoperability between NATO and Ukraine was achieving some results, with all respects to the defense and security reforms that Ukraine were pursuing, and some of them were definitely successful, political will was exactly as you mentioned, very much locked up on this perception that this decision definitely will create some escalation with the Russian Federation, and that's why all the possibilities of the Ukrainian membership, they were put under this very comfortable formula, which I already mentioned, that the Ukrainian Georgian membership will be decided some time in future without any clear commitments. And how to create those strategic conditions for those commitments were not clear. So everyone focused on the homework, and the homework first and foremost included the civilian control and democratic oversight of the defense and security sector, which is also a very broad topic, and you can work for it for ages. It was also the matter of the implementation of NATO standards in the C2, and Ukraine did some successes, but also, and still remains a lot of work to be done. C2 command and control, I mean, for those. And definitely, like I can list here a list of reforms both in the defense sector and the security and other areas. But nevertheless, in terms of political dialogue, when Ukraine applied, for instance, for the Enhanced Opportunities Program and said publicly that Ukraine would like to be the part of this club of NATO the most close partners, it was also created kind of storm, and it was discussed very, very long time between the allies, and no one was prepared for it. And so it took quite 3 or 4 years to get there in the end of the day. But the membership question was still out of the all discussions, basically saying, and specifically also there was a lot of irritation within NATO about Ukrainian persuasiveness in raising the question about the membership action plan. Now somehow the membership action plan is also not on the agenda of Ukraine, and Ukrainians are tend more to look at the precedent of Finland and Sweden. So if there is a political will, there are no other mechanism required to be member of NATO. I cannot say that I'm sure that this is the best example for Ukraine to follow. And the level, of course, the interoperability and then the NATO standards implementation in Finland and Sweden compared to Ukraine is a little bit different. But nevertheless, the political precedent was created, and now it's widely used by the Ukrainian political circles. So in terms of the what actually provoked the Russian full-fledged aggression, because I totally agree with the colleagues, I think that Volodymyr who mentioned that the war started in 2014, and now we talk about the large-scale aggression from the 24th of February, and I think in many cases, a lot of international colleagues, they tend to forget this 9 years of fighting. What actually I think provoked this full-fledged aggression was more indecisiveness and half-hearted decisions. And that concerns both the perspective of Ukrainian membership in NATO, and actually I'm coming back to Bucharest Summit in 2008 because according to the military intelligence of Ukraine, and it was I think voiced even very recently by the head of the military intelligence, Kirill Budanov, the actual preparation to this type of war against Ukraine started back in 2007 and 2008. So, and that was the period when Russia felt that its strategic ambitions to recreate this empire and sorry, I need to switch this on. To recreate the Russian Empire and to recreate basically the Soviet Union. Those ambitions were started not yesterday. They didn't start like last year. It was like the long-term strategy, and as well as Katerina absolutely correctly mentioned, it was also the matter of people closing eyes on Russian policies, closing eyes on Russia's ambitions, and on Russia's aggressive actions, both in Georgia and Syria and in other areas of the world. So, and that's like now we all pay the price, because I do understand that, of course, the Ukraine pays the ultimate price with the life of the soldiers, but also the European citizens and across the Atlantic, the citizens of the United States, Canada, also pay the price for supporting Ukraine, and we should also appreciate and understand that. So basically, yes, this aggression was provoked, but it was provoked by the indecisiveness and uncertainty of perceptions, and this trend continues, and that's why I would like to raise it as a lesson which was, in my view, identified, but still not learned. Because if we talk about what Katerina also mentioned, the vision of what comes as a Ukrainian victory, what comes also as not only Ukrainian victory, but also Russian strategic defeat, or maybe not defeat, but some kind of pacification of Russia or reshaping of Russia. There is no clear vision, both in NATO, or I think in even in the biggest capitals of NATO countries, unfortunately. And in addition to that, also people also shy away, but I would like at least with one small sentence mentioned here, there is also no clarity what to do with Belarus, which is also quite an interesting factor in the security and stability in this region. So, and for a long time, I think NATO public diplomacy, and I definitely can say that because I've used this sentence many times in the speaking points for NATO people in the Ukraine, is that Ukraine is key to Euro-Atlantic stability. So it was used very often, and I think in a way it's devaluated itself because you know, it was so much taken for granted that the key, Ukraine is the key to Euro-Atlantic stability, that now I think for many NATO members it was the revelation that how much Ukrainian situation influenced the policy of NATO. I will also maybe the last point about the lessons learned and about like what Ukraine did over 9 years in Ukraine and what NATO did in Ukraine for those 9 years, what can be the success of reforms or not. So definitely, of course, Ukrainian armed forces did a great progress if you compare the situation back in 2013 and on the eve of the aggression in February 2022. So that concerns both the way of organizing themselves, the way of training, the way of understanding the principles, basic principles. I wouldn't even say standards, but principles of NATO armies. Like the most practical example, I think it was widely used, is understanding of the Ukrainians and application by the Ukrainians of the principle of mission command. Which significantly differed in some even operational and tactical levels the behavior of Ukrainian troops from the Russian Federation. And those trainings, which were done actually not by NATO itself, they were done bilaterally. Here I would like to mention the UK operation, Orbital, and Canadian operation Unifier. So, and of course the US several missions, training missions in Ukraine. So I think in general, if I'm not mistaken, about 35,000 people were trained according to NATO standards by individual member states. That was done by the individual member states once more time to underline that NATO was not there and was not like in any case influencing the situation fighting in the east of Ukraine. But NATO did a lot of strategic advice to Ukrainian reform documents, including the Law on National Security, which was adopted in 2008. It's of course far from being ideal, but it gave the basic framework for Ukraine to develop, and if this framework was completed and like successfully implemented, it's not only strategic level, but the operational level, and then first the tactical level. That, of course, would be the huge prerequisite for Ukraine to claim very clearly that we are ready for the NATO membership.
We hope.
Yes, and in terms of Vilnius summit, because it was mentioned here, and it's very
final point. Okay, so
final point.
Q&A.
Sure. I also do not expect the very, specified decisions or clear statements at the Vilnius summit. There will be some announcements, definitely, given the situation. And as it was mentioned that Ukraine had distinctive and still have distinctive partnership with NATO. Also, Russia had distinctive partnership with NATO, and also Russia had the Russia-NATO Council, whereas Ukraine had NATO-Ukraine Commission, and which was blocked for like more than 6 years actually. So maybe there will be some decisions on that direction to raise the level of the importance of Ukraine in terms of NATO-Ukraine partnership. And I've heard, and this is pure speculation, but more important decisions and more specific decisions are to be voiced later at the Washington summit next year. But it's still yet to be dependent on the situation in the front line and on the security developments. Sorry very much, apologize for being a little bit maybe long, and not very much structured, but it was hard to be structured after so much brilliant comments by the speakers before me.
No, thank you, Oksana, especially for your final point about the importance of upcoming developments on the military battlefield. The next event within this series will be exactly about military and diplomatic challenges on the eve of counteroffensive operations. So we will have military experts talking about this kind of interrelation between military developments and diplomatic consequences of developments on the battlefield. But now we have maybe 7 minutes for the questions from the audience. I didn't really want to interrupt none of our speakers, but we are out of time and I don't want to keep waiting neither our audience nor speakers anymore. We will just take 5 more additional minutes. So if someone wants to put a question, please raise your hand or just unmute yourself. Tamila, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much. First of all, I wanted to extend warmest welcome to this distinguished panel of experts. I'm a professor in the International Relations Department at LSE, and I'm absolutely in awe at what Mariia has achieved in just a few months in terms of bringing out the voices of Ukraine, organizing different talks and events. And we've had some very, very distinguished speakers, and we also have some events in June, and photography and art exhibition, and of course there's the Ukraine Reconstruction Forum. So it's really, I'm very proud of LSE that we have inserted ourselves in this very important set of kind of as a kind of important voice, raising awareness about Ukraine. But I wanted to make a comment or question to the very, very interesting observations from the panel speakers by saying that I was just recently asked to review a book on Afghanistan called Bleeding Wound, and it's by an Israeli professor called Yaakov Roy, and it was astonishing. This book came out last year or even this year. It's based on materials that are already known, some new materials, but what I was really interested to see is that in that book, in terms of Russia's policy, you can substitute the word Afghanistan for Ukraine, and pretty much everything holds. How they lied, how they presented the invasion as a limited contingent, how they lied to their own people about the casualties, etc., etc. But what was interesting in that book, the author restates the kind of secret discussions in the Politburo between Brezhnev and some of the few people who made the decision to invade Afghanistan, and their main kind of objective was secretly articulated in that small circle, was that, well, if the Americans install some kind of eavesdropping device in Afghanistan, this will threaten Central Asian republics and our security. Of course, Central Asia was colonized by the Soviet Union and held together, through coercion. And so this logic of expansion, where does it stop, right? So you first incorporate Central Asia, and then when you feel threatened by the US, then you incorporate or seek to control Afghanistan. And of course, with Ukraine now, it's Poland that knows this logic and has been very vehemently really kind of articulating support for Ukraine. So I think this is something, I would urge all policymakers to read that refresh themselves about what happened with Afghanistan. So when we, when the Ukrainian colleagues are doing a lot of soul searching about what Ukraine did or didn't do, one should just reflect on this unstoppable logic of Russian imperial expansion. And on Katerina's and other colleagues' point about the the vision for the post-war and how to deal with Russia. I think in some ways Russia is already cannibalizing itself, just like the Soviet Union did with the Afghanistan war. So the argument in that book is that it destroyed the Soviet Union. And we are seeing now, because of course, there's a big secret about actual number of Russian casualties, but we know they're catastrophic, even in the multiples compared to what happened in Afghanistan. So in some ways, there's that kind of erosion of the regime that is already happening. But of course, there are also people like Gordon Brown. Today in The Guardian, there was an article. I think Gordon Brown was the former British Prime Minister. He's very much in the vanguard of advocating some kind of international legal instrument to bring Putin to the, to justice. And of course, it's the Americans, and I'd be curious what Volodymyr thinks about it. It's the Americans who are kind of really reluctant to support those efforts in terms of creating that international, whatever is for crimes of aggression or whatnot. So it's a set of jumbled comments, questions, any thoughts you have, I'd be really curious to hear. But thank you so much for this very interesting talk and set of observations.
Thank you, Tamila.
Volodymyr, right, very quickly then, on the International Tribunal, Americans are very touchy about that. It's a delicate issue for them. As you know, they are not part of International Criminal Court, for instance. Pentagon early in this war denied sending information about Russian military war crimes in Ukraine for the same reason, basically, that could be opening a precedent on whatever American soldiers did in this or that war. So they're not there, but at the same time, they are resisting very much. Ukraine was investigating war crimes committed by Russian military, just not completely on board with this idea of international tribunal. And also, as you know, Biden administration is deciding not to announce that Russia or declare Russia as a state as a sponsor of terrorism, despite the position of the Congress. So the previous speaker, Nancy Pelosi, decided not to push it. The current probably not going to do it, but the Congress was of same mind, that Russia is really worthy of, deserves this to be called a state sponsor of terrorism, but the administration decided against it. Apparently, they also are willing to keep some, bridges open, some channels open, not to bring, not to burn all bridges and stuff like that. And Afghanistan is a very interesting comparison. I never thought about it, Tamila, that you can compare it. But it's right. It's one imperialistic war and there's another. Except that Ukraine, of course, was being part of Russian Empire for a long time, and Afghanistan wasn't really. But yeah, and at least it took 10 years for the leader of Soviet Union to withdraw troops. But that took that leader to be Mikhail Gorbachev. With the current Russian leader in Kremlin, Mr. Putin, I don't think he will be doing that. And we are getting close to that mark if you count from 2014. But unfortunately, I don't think he will do that. So another interesting point, since you mentioned Afghanistan, is that a lot of people were comparing Ukraine and Afghanistan between August 21 and February 22 and saying like, oh, Ukraine is probably going to be next Afghanistan. I think we proved very firmly in the last year that we're not. We're fighting back. We're not a failed state. On the contrary, actually, I think our government is working better than since February last year than it was before. So there is clearly resilience, which you didn't see, unfortunately, in Afghanistan society and the power circles as well. Thank you.
And Katerina, maybe you also have a comment on that.
Tamila, thank you very much for your comment, and I'm happy to at least virtually meet you. I would just maybe very briefly say that indeed, when you look at the Russian interventions and oppression strategies and military strategies and torture strategies, I mean, you now read, for example, Ivan Bagriani, who wrote a novel based on his own experience of the inmate of the Russian camps. And you can see that what we hear from, for example, Russian, Ukrainian prisoners who were prisoners of war in Russia, the way they were treated, the way they talked, is just exactly the same. So basically, these textbooks of the Russian totalitarianism, Russian oppressive imperialism remain word to word the same. And I think I can only reiterate the point about the fact that we have been blind to it for a long time. So thank you for bringing this point out. This is a useful analogy. I would say that Ukrainian history within the Russian Empire, within Afghanistan, is not actually very simple. I will stop here, because it's a matter of another discussion. But it is very important to study history to see how the empire reproduces itself and tries to apply the same tactics.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and the final comment from Oksana.
Thank you. I will be short, actually, only about the expansion of the Russian borders. So basically, in Ukraine, we have a saying which is quintessence of the vision of where the Russian borders can stop. It's used a little bit not very proper language, so I will probably somehow rephrase it. But basically, saying Russian borders, while expanding, they will stop exactly where the lower part of Russian backs will be definitely forcefully kicked. So basically, only where the Russian will feel the real force, it's where the Russian borders will actually stop.
Okay, unfortunately, we don't have a time to wrap up, so I will just say that I've gathered a couple of comments or points with which I will close the discussion. So what to expect or what to do actually when it comes to diplomacy, not to repeat half-hearted agreements like Minsk agreements were, because the circumstances are completely different from 2014 when Ukrainian army was not ready to fight back, and this is a different situation now. Any kind of even fragile ceasefire will just bring the conflict to the stalemate and prolongation of occupation. Second, to put Ukraine's security both on the level of political decision-making and expert and academia discussion into a broader picture of post-war security architecture, and not just treat some arrangements for Ukraine as arrangements only for Ukraine, but for the entire Europe at least. Thirdly, to be ready for more tough times when it comes to new factors appearance, like maybe political discussion in a partner countries like US in the light of their domestic political processes. And last but not least, to invest resources into diplomacy in the broader terms of diplomacy, not only for like public service, but also representation of Ukrainian voice on the academia level, cultural representation abroad, and expert diplomacy. It's not an exhaustive list, but thank you so much to the speakers that they have found time to spend this more than 1 hour and a half with us. We will promote the event because it was recorded. So thank everyone who was listening to our speakers, and please register to our further events, which will continue from week to week up to the middle of June. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.